coming back to your body, that's what promotes authenticity. And if we're not shooting for authenticity, I'm not sure what we're doing. What is the agenda?
Welcome, everybody, to the latest new Psychonaut broadcast. With me today is Annie Boheler. Is that the right pronunciation, Annie? Yeah, right?
Yeah.
Yeah, excellent. Annie is a compatriot of mine from the Vital Psychedelic Training course from Psychedelics Today. Annie first caught my attention when we had to say how we identified in the first lesson. We're both in the same study group, taught by the magnificent Joanna Hiller of Exeter University. And Annie said, I identify as an anarchist. And I thought, this person's brilliant. And so she's going to talk a little bit about some of the activist work she's done over the years later on, but mostly we're going to talk about Annie's somatic experiencing practice and the sex positivity training for psychedelic therapists that she's developing. Annie, hello. Thank you so much for joining me from Santa Cruz in California today.
Thank you, Steve. I'm so happy to be here.
Tell us how your work with the body took you to psychedelic medicine.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So when I was a teenager, I started working with the body, my own body, because I had an unknown injury. For some amount of time, I walked around with 2 fractured vertebrae, probably from falling off horses. I rode horses.
And you couldn't feel it at all?
So basically, I was still mobile. I'm very lucky how the fractures happened. And every once in a while, I would like pick something up or reach for something and I'd be paralyzed just for a second, like a pinched nerve, and I would be frozen. So this happened a few times and then it started happening more. And so I think I was about 15 or so. And then when I went to get x-rayed for that, they found out I have an L6. So about 1 in 100 females have an extra lumbar vertebrae. And since then, my back healed fine, but I've dealt with a lot of chronic pain my whole adult life. So coming around into my early 20s, I started experimenting with psychedelics. I was healing from an abortion in my early 20s, and I really wanted to reclaim my awareness of my body. So I started studying herbalism in conjunction with psychedelics, which I think is an interesting piece in this larger conversation around psychedelic movement too. Yeah, because the psychedelics are an extension of herbal natural medicines too.
You work as a somatic experiencing practitioner.
Yes.
And they can find you on Instagram at Rewilding Intimacy, right? Which sounds like an excellent plan.
Yeah.
So you trained as a herbalist and you were working in sort of ecology and permaculture. That's correct, right?
Yeah, so I have a degree in biology with a focus on education, so bridging the science world and the layman's world. And then, sometime after college, I did work as an herbalist for 5 years at a local biodynamic farm here.
But you tell me, Annie, what somatic experiencing practice or therapy, what do people call it, and what it is, and just an overview and how you got into it.
I'll start off with the word somatics just means mind-body connection. So there's a number of somatic-based therapy modalities that people kind of form in their different ways, but basically somatics just means mind-body connection. From the perspective of therapeutics, like with a goal of healing or growing. So somatic experiencing, basically orienting around, our senses. If we round out an experience, even just now feeling, any sensations, the temperature of the air, any emotions, visualizations, impulse to move. This is a more full experience if we slow down enough to tune into these different things. So it doesn't look any one way because everybody's nervous system is different. And because we're socialized, most of us, many of us in the Western developed countries, to prioritize intellectualism as the type of thinking that we're all oriented around.
Mhm.
So talking, this cognitive process, this intellectual process, is often incorporated in one way or another because that's simply how we're socialized. And from the somatic experiencing perspective, we can consider not having access to sensations or being able to put words to emotions as a trauma too, because a lot of people have issues with that, or challenges, and it could be simply because that's just how they're wired, or it could be because they're socialized not to be in their body and not to feel their body.
Yeah, the first time a therapist told me how does it feel in your body? I just thought, what the hell are you talking about, mate? I'm a bit better at it now, but there is still a long way to go. So, yeah, I mean, to explain that a little bit, though.
Mhm.
Yeah,
Yeah.
how would that kind of work out in a somatic experiencing session?
Mhm. Well, and there's no right or wrong way. So, if somebody never really orients around sensation or emotion, there's no, it's not that they're having a less full experience. They might just orient more towards visualization or movement, or colors or words. I mean, words are happening through our bodies. So we can have somatic experiencing through words and thoughts too.
Right.
So what it looks like in a session could look like anything from just slowing down the conversation to tune in to, yeah, how does that feel right now to be saying this, to be naming this out loud? Does it feel comfortable, uncomfortable, or neutral? And just kind of checking in like in a more vague way like that. Um, or it could look like if someone is able to they could close their eyes or just kind of feel in and follow and track a sensation. Say, oh, I have this tightness in my chest, or I'm noticing some rumbling in my belly, or my hands are getting sweaty, and just bringing the attention to that, if it feels comfortable and not overwhelming. Um, and there's different ways to kind of play with that depending on what's happening, but basically no agenda, but to bring this observer perspective to what's happening without saying, oh, we need to fix this or do something with it. And just bringing that attention to the sensation, like, wow, after I shared about, breaking my spine when I was a teenager, I noticed, something. um, and then so that was something, for example, I did work through when I went through the training. This extra vertebrae in my spine, I built up a lot of emotion around that over the years, like painful emotion, that my life was like subject to this random mutation in my spine, and that I deal with a lot of chronic pain. And I really have identified as like a healthy athletic person. And I just feel like I can't do that because I have this chronic pain. I feel very old in my body. So going through that somatic experiencing program, I spent some time on this vertebrae. And now I orient around that as my teacher.
Right.
And my gratitude to my body for, I have to stay healthy or I'll have a lot of pain. And this gratitude now that I have for this this mutation in my back, and that's something I was able to like alchemize in my mind, and I have a lot less pain because of that. I still have to do my yoga and stuff like that, but I have a lot less pain in my back because of this process I went through.
Right. Well, when you sort of welcomed the extra vertebrae into your into your life, as it were, then it looked like a kind of a Jungian shadow
Yeah.
integration.
Yeah. And in the sessions with it, it's really bringing that attention to, oh, I have this pain, but normal, normally I might have some judgment or this sadness around it, and really going through those emotions in a more gentle way, slowing it down, having moments without any judgment, just being with that, and really just allowing the body to like notice what's happening in the body as we bring our attention in that observer way to that sensation or emotion or whatever.
Which is not really how the white middle class or some other demographics either tend to sort of live their lives or address their emotional concerns, is it? It's more about sort it out straight away as soon as you can. And for my own part, I can say that somatic experiencing has helped a great deal with certain posture issues picked up during lockdown that will not be discussed in a family psychedelic broadcast such as this. And I had my martial arts trainer over for the first time in a year recently. And even though I have not hit anyone else or the pads for a whole year, he said I had improved.
Wow.
So I think in terms of a awareness of the mind body connection and coordination,
Mhm.
it's really helped there. I'd even go as far as say my dancing's improved as well, but we certainly won't be talking about that.
That's
So
awesome.
I mean, and how is somatic experiencing relevant? I mean, should talk about somatic car too and
Yeah.
how that differs. But how is it relevant to sort of psychedelics and psychedelic therapy? Because one would think that was all internalized, blindfold, which I don't approve, but anyway, and more of a mental thing. But saying can be more of a body thing. Please tell everyone about that.
Yeah. Well, I don't know about you, but I know from my experience with psychedelics, it can bring up a lot of weird sensations or like new sort of feelings, and can be in the body in a way that's different. Sometimes the digestive system is um, hypermobile, and but having practiced tuning in to the body in a way that one feels safe, if it feels safe, kind of tuning in, that can be helpful for some psychedelic experiencing.
Mhm.
Um, but overall, to, I think, be able to explore ourselves in the psychedelic realms, um, a part of what's happening there is the capacity to just be with whatever comes up, even if it's a challenging emotion or a positive emotion, that we're not like judging that we're not like, I'm going to avoid negative emotions and move towards positive emotions. That could be helpful depending on what someone's dealing with in a particular moment, but that non-attachment can help us not spiral. So if we're like, oh, I'm realizing I have this paranoid feeling, sometimes a paranoid feeling can come up with psychedelics. And if we're able to say like, oh, I'm noticing like I have this discomfort, and just to be with that without latching onto that and like, oh, what's this about? And then start to spiral down this like trigger vortex in our minds. Um, Basically, if we have some experience with somatics or somatic experiencing, we've increased our internal capacity to be with emotions in general, whether they're comfortable or uncomfortable. And this can allow us to have a bit more, I guess, control because of that awareness and comfortability with discomfort, that increased capacity during a psychedelic experience. With the psychedelics are an opportunity to bridge and expand like what is happening in the mental health field. But I've chosen not to go back to specific academic institutions, simply because it doesn't reflect my constitution. and diving into natural medicines, into community, into activism, these were the things that I just organically moved to as a part of healing from university. I'm like, what else is there besides writing papers? You know, there's so many books written. I couldn't read all the books I want to read in my life. So I just, and from, while I've benefited and appreciate the therapists I have and have had, it's a very specific container. And we can have healing happen in many different containers and situations. And it was my understanding, because I was living basically in like a hippie commune for most of my 20s, that we need therapy as a result of a lack of community. It's not that simple, but it also is a part of what's happening. Like, we in the US at least have a very individualistic, this rugged cowboy individualistic like culture. We just do things on our own. There's a stigma. There was, before COVID at least, more of a stigma around getting mental health support. And while therapy helps a lot of people, once again, myself included, I do think it's a product of exploitative capitalism, where we're going to remove your ability to be an organic person, an animal, having community, doing, whatever, getting your needs met from your
Well, they don't make enough money, do they? Like amateur dramatics associations and working men's clubs and all these things. They just simply don't make enough money to be suffered in the modern world.
Yeah, for sure. And it's funny because I was in this 24-hour microdosing event recently put on by Entheo Nation out of Washington. We were in this conversation, and one of the folks on the call was talking about the history of psychiatry and how these places used to really heal people. People would choose to go on retreat, basically, and the therapists there they would just go on walks in the woods and talk to them. And, you'd go on a weekend retreat, you'd check yourself in if you were feeling a little bit like out of it. And, eventually these therapists are like, it was really working. This was before, before the pharmaceutical companies really came up in like the 80s, late 70s and 80s. And they're like, we need recognition, that we're helping people. And the sects of psychiatry and psychology formed, where we need recognition for helping people, and steepened the power hierarchy there, as opposed to people just helping people. Which in and of itself, one, can be very helpful for people. And this is the reflection I've had for, as you know, the therapists in our class, where if we give somebody a diagnosis, or one who's deemed allowed to do that, a therapist from the DSM-5, one, they're based off of symptoms. So they make a diagnosis based off of symptoms. So it's top down. Mm-hmm. In reality, you and I could have the same symptoms, but they could be from different causes. Mm-hmm. So this is why traditional Western therapy is not actually trauma informed, for that reason, because it's missing that bottom up piece. Well, why is that person even behaving that way?
Okay.
And so right now, as psychedelics merge with above ground therapy, as trauma healing and somatics merge with traditional therapy, this bottom up approach, where you just notice what you're experiencing without judgment as part of the therapy, is really going to change like all like how therapy works in general, like the standardization of therapy, I think.
And like how? What's it? So do you think that everyone's, most therapists are going to need to be trauma informed and somatic informed? I mean, certainly very good clinical psychologist who I work with, Dr. Stephen Blumenthal, who did he did a big documentary that US viewers won't know last year on the BBC. He says that obviously, I mean, men in particular, but we don't purely communicate through words.
Mhm.
We communicate through our actions, through our body language, all these things as well. And none of this is taken into account in talk therapy.
Right.
So you're saying it's going to have to be taken into account?
I
And
think it
where
is.
does the sex stuff that we're all dying to get onto come into it?
Yes. Yeah. And I think that's a part of it too. Therapists are not trained in sex positivity. Therapists aren't trained in somatics. And so all of this is changing now because this is becoming quite obvious that missing these pieces is actually harmful. If there is,
How's it becoming obvious?
sorry.
How's it beginning to show itself? By the therapy not working, or cases coming
So
along?
I think there's more and more people out there who like me. My personal experience is I have since 2017 been working in my private coaching practice, working with clients who have, a lot of them have done therapy for years and it hasn't helped. A lot of them have issues relating to sexuality that they simply haven't been able to be supported with their practitioner, with their therapist. So it's like I'm working full time for myself now, this practice off of the blinds, built off the blind spots of therapy. So there are many people out there working as coaches or other alternative healing modalities that are filling in the gaps, which are vast, of how traditional talk therapy has not worked for many people.
Well, this is something again that we've mentioned in class, isn't it? Is they call us the psychedelic underground. Really, we are the psychedelic overground. We run the banks, we make the TV shows, we staff the hospitals and the fire stations. And it is the psychotherapy sector that is putting itself out of business.
Exactly. Yeah. Yeah. And I'm going to talk about somatica and then we can talk about sex positivity, but real quick, because of what you just said is huge. My career, my life, I very much orient around permaculture principles. So this is regenerative living. And a permaculture principle that can especially be applied to work.
Hang on a sec. So permaculture is a farming thing mostly, but this is fascinating that you say that the theory can be applied elsewhere. Tell everyone what permaculture is quickly.
So permaculture is a way of living that can be applied to food and growing food, but also just our social ecology or your business, of which is regenerative, meaning we can take it, it's beyond sustainable. We can heal what we've damaged in our emotions, on the soil, in our air, everything. We can heal and we can sustain moving forward. So permaculture is a design system that can be applied to the specifics of an organization or the biosphere of a certain area.
Right. So question for the agricultural history buffs. What's the difference between that and crop rotation?
So crop rotation could be a specific way of growing food that could be within the umbrella of permaculture.
Right.
Like we want to rotate what's growing in the soil so that if strawberries are always having, in the Monterey Bay where I live, we have to use a bunch of chemicals. People use a bunch of chemicals on strawberries because they get this fungus called verticillium, because everybody needs to have strawberries all the time. So we could just rotate them with broccoli because broccoli kills verticillium, but because we have to have strawberries all the time, no matter what. It's, we pump a bunch of chemicals on them instead of crop rotating so that we can always have strawberries. That's an example of why crop rotation is useful.
Right. Because I was on a call with the R Trust, who run the transpersonal psychology program over here that Dr. David Luke, Titan of the UK space, oversees. And they were talking about seasonal aspects to the therapeutic process and how these seasons can influence our feelings and our mindset. Maybe having all these foods out of season is contributing to our disenchantment and our disembodiment. But sorry.
Yeah, no, that's a really great perspective to put in too, because everything that's happening with us is happening in a context. So that's, that's why therapy is changing. We're not happening in a vacuum. Our dysfunctions, our coping mechanisms, they're not happening in a vacuum. They're happening in a context. So our dysfunctional coping mechanisms, could also be viewed as a response, a natural response to a dysfunctional environment or society, and that's this non-pathologizing perspective that, it's like, are people depressed because they're lacking psychedelics, or are they depressed because they're not sure how they're going to pay their rent next month? So you can have this healing happen, but then you have to go back to the stressors of society of which we live in, where cars are valued over life in some places, or, the quarterly revenue is valued over the watershed, for example. So these are the contributors to many people's, they might not know it, but we are happening in a context. So I'm going to bring it back to somatica.
Yeah. So somatica.
As a 20-year-old, I was dancing over the hill in San Jose, doing basically adult bar dancing, erotic dancing. And so I had experience, and for me, it was something I leaned into because it was fun, simply fun. And also unsustainable, like, okay, it wasn't the right atmosphere for me long-term. And because I was introducing myself to these sex positive communities, it led me to the somatica community. It's a training, but basically sex positive coaching, which doesn't look any one way. Basically, sex positivity for me can be defined just as long as it's a consensual exchange. So that means being aware of power dynamics too. As long as it's consensual, there's no judgment around whatever someone's doing for their sexuality or how they orient around sexuality, including asexuality. So, we definitely, me in the US, we're living in this culture that was colonized by Puritans. And we were living in the, we've never addressed that overall in our culture. And now we're starting to fill in the gaps, I feel like, around, before we hit record, we were talking about like objectification and like, people get objectified non-consensually because in this culture. So, women are often overly sexualized, superficially, and then men are overly sexualized in assuming men are sexual, right? Like you just assume a man is interested in sex. So that's a way we objectify men sexually. And that sort of pressure is just, it's unfair. So getting connected with our authenticity, how do we want to relate to our sexuality? It requires unlearning from our socialization for most of us. So, okay, so my concern, sex. My concern is if folks are going into a psychedelic therapy space and there hasn't been conversation or work around what if it's relevant to that person, or if it could come up, sexual healing. What do you do? How do you hold that space? Similarly, as somatic experiencing could help someone, could benefit someone going into psychedelic space. Same with that sex positive awareness. So if you go into a therapy office, there is an inherent power dynamic. You're paying that person for the service, and they're the therapist who has this education. So it's their responsibility to bring up the things that might be difficult to bring up for the client or recipient. Like, hey, how is your sex life? Or have you had any challenges around your sexuality? And to normalize it. Hey, I'm comfortable saying, talking about this. Just to let you know, if it's ever something you want to talk about, I'm comfortable talking about sexuality. That's something that's missing in a lot of therapy spaces, because facilitators are not trained around sex positivity. Basically acknowledging we all have been impacted by shame around sex because of our socialization, and going to get a therapy license doesn't get rid of that shame. They take like one class around sex at all. So, and it's hard to heal some of our stuff around sex by just talking about it, getting into our bodies. Hey, just talking about this subject, what are you noticing in your body? What does it feel like to be bringing up this topic of sex, and bringing it into the present moment? So if it's relevant for somebody, being able to talk about that beforehand, because from my experience, which is fairly varied in and around psychedelics, there's all sorts of things that could come up, and it could be non-sexual but very intimate. Someone could be like, I'm going to take off all my clothes because of any reason on psychedelics. There's a bee in my clothes. Society. I'm taking off my clothes. And it could be non-sexual. Or it could, if someone's doing MDMA therapy, probably going to come up,
Yeah, I did think when we were having the old ethics class and it was all around classical, i.e. real psychedelics, and nobody mentioned all this MDMA they're giving to people who've never had it before.
Exactly. So if somebody is reclaiming their body, perhaps, or shedding a layer of shame, loving their body for the first time in a new way, or just feeling good in their body for the first time in a long time, or something like that, how can we support that? And the therapist feels safe. Everything's, because basically why I brought up the ethics protocol is the only mention around sex is like, don't have sex with your clients, don't have any sexual relationship with your clients, and touch only happens with consent. And any sort of touch, like if you're gonna maybe hold someone, hug them, or have your hands touching or touch their arm, all of that's talked about beforehand, which is great, but we need to be expanding on that.
I mean, what I find, this is a bit of a confession, because oh God, hang on, how do I say this without getting myself in trouble? When one is guiding or sitting at the ceremony, it's difficult. It's easy to forget that they're not all your mates at a rave. And you can't just put your arm around and go, you're right, mate, you're right, you're right. Because you just can't, no way. You're like, it's not the done thing within the therapeutic scene, but it might be more the done thing in a more of a friendly context or an underground context.
Right. And there's so much there, because like, I think in the therapeutic realm, it can be scary to even just be talking about this. It's like, well, what kind of touch are you trying to have with like that's not what it's about. It's about being able to be a person in that moment. And I've sat with people where I'm holding them like a baby as they're crying, and there are certain rules, laws coming out, or structures for like an organ that just passed, that technically that would not be allowed, because you can't hold somebody and touch like under their leg like that. So if somebody, once again, in a psychedelic experience is going through a little bit of like an ego death or rebirthing, and they're like, will you hold me? And if the therapist is not sure that they should touch someone like that, that's gonna mess with the client.
Yeah, because it's dissonance with.
And then they're like, oh, should I not have asked for that? I mean, it's really easy to just like get up into our heads, under a psychedelic. And I don't know about you, but my experience with MDMA and other substances, including LSD, is this hyper, that for me, like the empathy is turned up so high. And so if I'm with my friend, I'm like, oh, I want to put my arm around them. Like they seem like they could use some support. And I'm checking in. I'm like, is this okay? Is this okay that we're this close and I have my arm around you? And really checking in. But that closeness just can be the ultimate healing. And it's as simple as that.
Yeah, I've heard from friends who were having a terrible time on, e.g., ayahuasca, and eventually worked up the courage to say, assistant facilitator, please come over here. And all it took was a bit of a, waving of feathers and a bit of personal comfort.
Right.
To help them out a bit.
Right. Yeah. So I just think for safety for everybody and to optimize healing in these amplified spaces, there needs to just be more conversation about the reality here.
So practical advice, what does one actually do if the voyager becomes sexualized?
Sure. So,
and sorry, you've said there are different ways of becoming sexualized. So let's just.
So I think that this would be something, once again, a reason to have these conversations beforehand and for the practitioner to be aware of what they're comfortable with. So for example, let's say the journeyer starts either touching themselves or taking off their clothes. The sitter or guide might just say, hey, this is, if it's not comfortable, it's not within the boundaries to be like sitting near each other. If that's happening, say, hey, I support you being with yourself, and I'm just gonna leave the room for 10 minutes. Is that something that's been talked about before? Could you leave that person for 10 minutes? Would that be safe? Or if you just kind of turned like away and you're not like just watching them, is that something that's comfortable?
What if they kept doing it? How would you say, look, mate, please, you're here to do other things? Or do you even say that? How does it work in a more awkward context?
Right. I think, once again, that's why these conversations would be important to have before going into a psychedelic space, so that both people know like what are the boundaries and what's comfortable. Because for me, one of the reasons why I feel passionate about this is because healing comes from choice. So if an adult is under the influence of a substance, it's still their body to choose what's healing, in my understanding. But if you're in a therapist's office and they're like, you can't be doing that here, that's also a part of reality. But when somebody's under the influence of a psychedelic, we want to be really careful about reinstating shame into somebody's nervous system. Why can't they do that? Is it because it's messy in the office? Is there some way we could prepare for that if that was a thing? Is this person trying to have this pleasurable experience to escape deeper healing? Because that could be a thing where you want to redirect them. But maybe someone is enjoying their body like for the first time in forever, so that's why these discussions, might be had beforehand. Like, what is the person's relationship with their body? What is the person's relationship with their sexuality? And
And do you
to
find those, sorry, I'm really sorry to jump in. Do you find those conversations difficult to have at the moment? Do you have them with your patients, and how does it kind of work out? Are the patients foragers, what please, what clients, what do you, how do they take it? Is it less awkward than you might think? Or is it, but because I think what we're all worried about here is kind of legal stuff, isn't it?
right,
Most of all.
right. Which is why there is this like bridge to gap, which is why this is important. I have a sex positive coaching practice. It's very explicit. It's why clients come to work with me. So it's already out there. And when I'm first talking with someone or we're first getting to know each other, I'll say that I'm like, this is inherently awkward to be talking about your personal life with someone you don't know. I mean, it might feel awkward. I don't know, but just naming that many people feel awkward just talking about it. So putting that out there as my responsibility as the person who's apparently some sort of leader in this situation, right? They're paying me for a service. So it's my job to put that out there and say, hey, this is why you're here. This is normal. And we're going to go at your pace, whatever that means. And it's inherently awkward.
Wow. So what sort of thing, I mean, say if you can't talk about this, but what sort of things do people come to you about? Are they trying, is it a sexual trauma thing? Is it a shame thing?
Sure.
Is it what? And do you have to screen them? I mean, did you get, I mean, yeah, what
Yeah.
happens?
Yeah. And I will make a clarifying statement that while I have 13 plus years experience with psychedelics, and I have a decent amount of experience sitting for folks, I am being very careful about any sort of integration with, if somebody is working on something sexually related in the context of psychedelics.
Right.
Because it is going to be a specific relationship between me and that person and how they relate to that somatics work, and I'm not worried about a license, but that's kind of my point too of this conversation is, hey, I have supervisors, I'm in training, I have mentors, for my work, and I really don't want, I'm already operating on the margins, so I can't afford to have some sort of situation that's unethical in my work. That's how I am operating from. So I just wanted to clarify that I very much have different sects of my work. SE.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. I wasn't, viewers, I wasn't inferring that Annie is already steaming full ahead with as the new Willem Reich, incorporating psychedelics and body therapy. It's what I was more thinking about the sex positive somatic practice.
Yeah. And a range from sexual challenges like libido differences, and if you have a partner or you're dating, libido or desire differences, difficulty orgasming, sexual trauma for sure.
But these are the kind of things that are coming up at the moment that people are presenting with right now.
Yeah. Communication issues, just like, going into that trigger vortex with your partner or even in your own mind, learning about your own triggers.
And intimacy issues as well. I mean, I read that frightening book, The Trauma, is it the Fantasy Bond? Where we start off, sharing intimacy, and then we gradually withdraw it as we become more and more nervous about it threatening the relationship. And of course, that in turn threatens the relationship.
Yeah, and that can happen so many different ways. And there's trauma bonding where it could be conscious or subconscious or anywhere in between, like you're bonding over and around your traumas. And yeah, so, once the honeymoon phase is over and the hormones have worn off, which could be months to years, a lot of people are facing like a whole different dynamic in their relationship. You know, and there's so many things that influence that. We've been taught to be passive in relationships. So we get on this relationship escalator where expectations and intimacy are escalating without explicit consent around what's happening. So there's all sorts of things that influence it. But yeah, a wide range from like dysfunctions or challenges and traumas to opening up the relationship, like moving to an open relationship from monogamous or the other way around, you know, helping folks transition from one type of relationship structure to another. Those are areas I work with.
And so how about all kind of friends with benefits and polyamory and things like this? Are they sort of affecting the way sex, you know, sex therapy is done? And presumably it's the same kind of people looking at psychedelic medicine that are in those sort of more progressive relationship trends as well, right?
Yeah. And it's interesting because like the word progressive could land in people different ways, because there's a lot of people in poly communities who are not necessarily doing things more ethically.
Right.
I'm just here for whatever. So without, you know, learning these, you know, it's a more complicated, it's inherently more complicated, adding more sexual partners. So that means we need to communicate like a little bit more, whatever that looks like. But yeah, I mean, I've lived in the Bay Area since I was 19. I mean, there's just a large community around open relating, and I think younger generations too, just realizing, hey, if I am traveling half the year for my work, or I you know, get this need met with this person and this need met with this person, like why stick to tradition for tradition's sake? If somebody wants to be monogamous, it should be a choice and not a social pressure. That's kind of like my attitude that I come from, because
Sorry to jump in. Do these kind of things, do they break down under the psychedelic experience, or do they unfold under the psychedelic experience? I suppose, putting it over-simply, do people find themselves becoming sort of more liberal sexually under psychedelics, or is it more of a personal thing where someone might think to themselves, do you know what, I've got to start, you know, I actually want to be, you know, want to start a family now. I want to, you know, focus on one person. Not that I'm saying one is, you know, ethically or morally preferable. I'm just thinking more in terms of the times and how people are, you know, relating to each other and society. Yeah.
I mean, it's a good question. And so my understanding and experience is that psychedelics help us get to know ourselves better. If psychedelics are a good tool for you, and if they're not a good tool for you, you can find other tools to help to get to know yourself better. So when we get to know ourselves better, we might have more clarity around what types of relationships we want. So that's once again why I think sex positivity is really helpful for psychedelic therapy, because generally some people have wounds from all sorts of things, the car wreck, a hurricane, but like most of our emotional wounds come from emotional interpersonal relationships. So if somebody's trying to figure out what type of relationships they want to have, and we're socialized in a very monogamous situation, we're socialized to be monogamous. Even in the Bay Area, there's a lot of openness here, but like we're still living in a monogamous culture.
And it's almost seen as aspirational, isn't it? My feminist academic friend, Dr. Lulu LeVay, will tell you how on television, for example, that the gay character starts off as being very liberal sexually, but at the end it's a happy ending because they found somebody and settled down.
More mature.
Yeah, precisely. It's seen as a goal, almost.
Well, and that comes back to like sexual suppression in general. It's like, oh, if you're just out there and not settled down, if you're interested in fun, then it's trivial.
Wow.
Recreational psychedelics is trivial. That is what we hear in like psychedelic therapy a lot. Like acting like people can't heal in community. So, which is false. And actually very dangerous, because people are going to be doing these substances, and they are. So we should have a harm reduction, you know, focus, I think.
And you introduced me to an incredible book slash author slash area called Embodiment Strategy. Have I got that right? And Pleasure Activism.
Oh, emergent strategy.
Emergent Strategy. My bad. Emergent Strategy. So you introduced me to a wonderful book slash
Yeah,
area called Emergent Strategy. What's she got? Adrian Murray Webb?
Adrienne Marie Brown. Yeah.
Murray Brown. Thank
Yeah.
you. But so why in this very hedonistic, individualistic society do we need pleasure activism? What's the difference between the sort of immediate instant gratification of consumer hedonism
Mhm.
and embodiment or pleasure activism?
Yeah. Well, I feel like you just answered that question too. It's like, it is, I I do think many people, and maybe from other cultures too, could look at American culture as like this hypersexualization, and like, well, we do have a very sex positive culture because of this, hypersexualization in some ways, um, and so I think it's coming back to like, is it for pleasure? Is it for escapism? Is it connected to the rest of our lives? Whether that's you're having friends with benefits or you're married, anywhere in between, it doesn't matter what your personal preference is, but coming back to that personal preference around, hey, maybe someone does want to have casual sex with their friends because that benefits their friendship. Maybe somebody does want to expand off how they define intimacy. I connecting the anarchism to relationship anarchism. One of the foundations of relationship anarchism is the desire to value everybody's feelings equally in your life. Anyone you're deciding you want to be close with you as a friend, it could be a platonic friend, a family member, that everybody's situation is important and worth care, not just the person who you're having sex with being the main person. So sex can be valued. I like sex. Sex is fun. Hopefully people can have fun having sex. But that you don't put this person on a pedestal because you have sex with them and then ignore the rest of your community, which I know from my experience, having the first 10 years of my adult life be a monogamy hangover, even though I knew I was open, but having these vestigial remnants of monogamy culture influencing me all the time, even though I proactively educate myself around it, that we do start to orient around one person, and partnership is great. And how can we acknowledge we want partnership or whatever we might be doing with that person, while also, valuing the other people in our life and their feelings, and, how we can create community together. And I think this deeper integration of our pleasure, pleasure coming back to our senses, like somatic experiencing. How can we get pleasure from widening our sensate experience, from being able to breathe in the crisp, cool air of the fall and to have pleasure from that? That's dangerous to capitalism. That's why, we've been socialized to not be embodied, because if we can get our pleasure from our neighbors and our friends and the green grass in the yard, and, grow some herbs and have the smells, like if we can get our pleasure needs met in those simple ways, we might not need Walmart as much, that sort of thing. I don't know if that makes sense, but that's kind of some of the connection, my personal connection with like emergent strategy, and how can we work together in ways, this underground or the overground meeting with medical therapeutics within the psychedelic movement. How can we work together and it not be like, a divisive conflict? It's this way or it's this way. And I hear a lot of therapists in some of these sessions, these webinars and stuff popping up, commenting on the ethical issues of people without therapy training doing psychedelic sitting for other people.
Yeah, I got a trashing in the first ever study group, didn't I? Because I said the underground doesn't have a fantastic reputation here amongst people who've never experienced it. And obviously that last bit got kind of lost, and I got trouncing by the underground practitioners. And having since experienced the underground, I must say it was it felt safer than therapy, if I'm being completely honest. Now that is a very, again, subjective view from my own, but I have felt that it's almost like the rules are causing more trouble than without. And we've spoken before about how in the underground, even if it's a rave, then codes of behavior emerged in the rave scene very quickly. Okay, that girl over there isn't wearing very much and she's dancing erotically, but that does not mean that you are allowed to go and touch her. In fact, quite the opposite. And these rules came up very quickly, and they grew organically and they grew naturally.
Yeah.
But the medical sector, thinks that its endless reams of paperwork are going to work better. And, this is to an extent, of course, a blinking lawyers thing.
Right.
Isn't it? Right. I mean, how do you think they can work better together? What would be your recommendations?
So the average person out there who might be seeking psychedelic support, they might not know what the options are. So they might, if they go to, let's say, their doctor or a therapist, they might, if that doctor or therapist has this lack of awareness or a stigma around this, they might say either that's dangerous altogether if they're totally uneducated, or it's only safe in this therapeutic context, which might be true for some people. So for me, I come from the perspective of people need options and choice, and it's their choice. And that is healing in and of itself. Because if somebody's depressed or anxious or having challenges, it's often the lack of choice that is a part of, one, why they're having those issues to begin with, like something happened to them or didn't happen that should have happened. And so having that authority of choice for their own healing and saying, hey, here are all these options. You could go to this ceremony with this group and it's a group work. You could go to this person and they have a yurt in the woods, and there's, here's their organization. There's a couple people. Here's this therapist in this, office. That people deserve to have options, I think. And to assume
some people are going to prefer a therapist's office, a doctor.
Exactly. That's going to feel safe for some people.
Yeah.
And people can only heal when they're feeling safe.
It's like when you show your friends the ceremony and go, you should be going to this really, and they go, it doesn't look like my sort of thing. And you think maybe it isn't actually.
Exactly. So. Yeah. Everybody, different strokes for different folks. So people just should have options, I think. And so I think psychedelics, that's like the energy of psychedelics is there is no right or wrong way. And we are all connected by love. And so if we can all use this opportunity to work together and to be more explicit around power dynamics, of which are a core of our issues to begin with, right? Then we can optimize the healing potential of these medicines.
And how do you make the average client feel a bit more comfortable
Yeah. Um, a couple of different things. One, that there is this practice of attunement, like kind of being able to see, reflect this person's energy. They're more reserved, or they're really excited to share, whatever, wherever their energy is coming from. Um, once again, explicitly naming that, hey, we're about to talk about something really intimate, and this is only our first time meeting, so you only share what you want, and there's no pressure. And just really being transparent in that, or saying, hey, I do this for my work, it's very comfortable for me, and there's no problem that it seems a little bit new for you. That's okay, there's no problem there. Or
So, sorry,
what
please.
makes asking them what to share times when they've felt really safe. And for them, maybe they've never even asked themselves that. So get them to, orient around, once again, their autonomy, and, oh yeah, I have felt safe. And this, let me share, this is what it was like. This is what safety means for me.
Because sometimes with the psychotherapeutic process, one often feels like the therapist is looking for an answer, and they know what it is, but they're trying, you're supposed to kind of come up with it of your own accord. So I end up sort of thinking, right, but what am I, how do I, what's the right course of action that I'm supposed to be taking here,
Right.
rather than, being in my body and thinking, what is the course of action that I want, or my body wants, or my nervous system wants me to take here.
Right. Yeah. And that juxtaposition and that example you just gave, like that second piece coming back to your body, that's what promotes authenticity. And if we're not shooting for authenticity, I'm not sure what we're doing. You know, what is the agenda? And if we're trained, and once again, we need to be working together, and there's room for everything. There's a time and a place for diagnostics. But if somebody's trained only from a diagnostics perspective to see everything from symptoms to coping mechanisms to problems, changing behavior, that's a problem. That's why we're having a mental health crisis. There's transpersonal psychology has merged, as you know, because you've studied Jung a bit, with Western psychology. Transpersonal psychology, my understanding, is basically American psychology acknowledging that other cultures exist. Like, oh, our psyches aren't happening in a vacuum, they're happening in a context. And for those interested in academia, there's another more, I consider an evolution of psychology happening, called liberation psychology. One of my mentors is getting her PhD right now in liberation psychology, and mentor, supervisor, practitioner of mine. And then I just had a 5-week session with Keela Riley around power dynamics and interpersonal relationships coming from BIPOC, people of color, and queer folks, and how those power dynamics happen in relationship. So liberation psychology is basically about acknowledging the experience of those who have been marginalized, and acknowledging the larger societal power structures that impact our psyches. So once again, acknowledging where it happened in a context, and it's almost like an expansion from transpersonal psychology too.
Mm-hmm. So your training program, you're developing it right now. You're hoping to launch it next year.
Yeah, I'm not into making promises in general, but it's happening. It's in the works, and there's so what will be coming out as a first step will be professional case consultation meetups around these subjects. So if you are a facilitator or therapist and you don't necessarily have sex positive training or psychedelic training, and your clients are bringing these things up, and you would like support in a confidential space with other practitioners, that will be, yeah, that's what is more immediate as a stepping stone for this program.
And if people want to hear about that, they can find your website, Loveage Somatics, yeah, Loveage. I like Loveage, but Loveage is fine. Loveage Somatics, and of course, people can have the choice, can't they? They can interpret it how they like, because they kind of means the same things. There's no confusion. And on Instagram at Rewilding Intimacy. So like Jeremy Clarkson did with his bottom field, except for intimacy. And you're going to have a meetup as well, aren't you? January the 23rd, 2023 in Santa Cruz in person, right?
So I'm teaming up with a friend, colleague of mine, who is a licensed therapist, and we're going to be doing in-person psychedelic integration circles starting January 23rd. We'll be meeting weekly on Mondays.
Yeah.
So yeah, a few new offerings. And if you sign up for my newsletter through my website, then you can keep posted on that.
Yeah. Annie, thank you so much. This has been very enlightening for a repressed straight white male such as myself.
Well, yeah, very easy to talk with you, Steve, and thank you so much.
Annie, thanks loads and loads. I will see you in class.
Sounds good.